On March 17, 1943, a pale light crept through the curtains of a wood-paneled office in Berlin. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris sat at his desk, fingers trembling against a single sheet of paper. To an outsider, it looked harmless, just numbers, typed neatly by an intelligence clerk. But to Canaris, seasoned by decades of naval command and espionage, it was as dangerous as a ticking bomb. The report claimed that an American factory, still being expanded in Michigan, would soon roll out a 4-engine bomber every 60 minutes, 1 per hour, 24 a day. More than 700 in a month. He read the line again, as though repetition might expose a flaw, but the data was solid. His spies had risked their lives for it, whispering across neutral embassies and sending desperate cables in code. A Swedish engineer described an aircraft line moving with the rhythm of car manufacturing. A diplomat in Washington reported numbers with an extra zero, numbers so vast they almost mocked belief. A businessman swore he had walked through a plant so enormous it seemed to generate its own weather. Canaris's analysts cross-checked it all, and the conclusion was inescapable. America had begun to wage a new kind of war, not with divisions of men, but with divisions of machines. Outside his office, Berlin still staggered from the shock of Stalingrad. Streets that once roared with parades now carried whispers of defeat. Soldiers on leave spoke less of glory, more of mud, frostbite, and endless Soviet tanks. In North Africa, Rommel's vaunted Afrika Corps was being squeezed between Montgomery and the Americans. Yet, at the top, in Hitler's circle, the fantasy of invincibility still ruled. Canaris felt the air in the office heavy with dread. He was no Nazi fanatic, never had been. He was a professional, a man trained to deal in realities, however unpleasant. And the reality now was brutal arithmetic. Germany had perhaps 12,000 tons of aluminum for aircraft production in 1943. America's stockpiles exceeded 10 times that. Germany's entire bomber output struggled to reach a few dozen per month. If this Michigan plant succeeded, it would outproduce the Luftwaffe's entire heavy bomber industry on its own. He leaned back in his chair, hearing the creak of wood. He thought of a young agent he had lost in Lisbon, caught passing notes about American factories. The boy had died with a knife in his ribs, and for what? For this knowledge, a prophecy of defeat. Canaris whispered to himself, if these numbers are true, Germany is already finished. Meanwhile, in Hitler's Wolf's Lair hundreds of miles away, news was filtered, twisted, dressed up in ideology before it reached the Führer's ears. Hitler still believed that destiny, racial superiority, and sheer willpower would crush the Allies. He despised statistics, but Canaris understood. Wars were not won by will alone. They were won by steel, oil, wheat, and coal. By the factories that turned raw resources into wings, guns, and engines. This sheet of paper was more than intelligence. It was a death sentence written in numbers, and Canaris knew he had to deliver it, no matter how unwelcome. Yet even as he prepared to report, a darker realization gnawed at him. Truth itself had become the most dangerous enemy inside the Third Reich. The Abwehr's headquarters in Berlin hummed with low voices and typewriters, but beneath the surface it felt like a morgue, facts gathered, filed, and too often buried alive. Canaris paced the corridors with the report in hand, his mind a storm of calculation. He had seen wars won and lost, but never on this scale. Modern conflict was not a duel of swords or a chess match of generals. It was a contest of furnaces, machine tools, and assembly lines. Germany, he realized, was waging a 19th-century war against a 20th-century titan. The Americans had something the Nazis could neither imitate nor crush. A society that mobilized in ways ideology declared impossible. At Willow Run in Michigan, the Ford Motor Company was tearing apart the very idea of aircraft construction. Instead of master craftsmen laboring for months, they trained thousands of ordinary men and women to perform one task, again and again, until the parts fused into a bomber. Each rivet, each wire, each panel, clicked into place with factory precision. It was the Model T philosophy, applied to a machine of war. In Berlin, officers laughed when Canaris's analysts described it. Airplanes are not automobiles, one scoffed. This is Yankee boasting. But in Michigan, the laughter belonged to the workers. To Rose Monroe, a young widow who drilled aluminum panels and later lent her name and face to the figure of Rosie the Riveter. To a sharecropper's son from Mississippi, who riveted alongside an immigrant from Poland. Neither fitting Nazi categories of superior man, but together building the machines that would darken Europe's skies. Nearly a third of Willow Run's 40,000 workers were women. 10% were black Americans. It was the mongrel society Hitler mocked, and yet it was outproducing the so-called master race. Canaris's officers compiled these human details into their reports. The vast building that required a 90-degree tax turn to avoid crossing into a neighboring county. The non-stop shifts that turned farmland into a 24-hour hive of sound. "They will drown us in airplanes," one Abwehr analyst muttered, "like ants building a hill of steel." And yet, when Canaris carried the dossier to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the man who fancied himself the father of German air power, he was met, not with alarm, but with ridicule. Göring, bloated in his tailored uniforms, waved the papers away. "Americans build refrigerators and razor blades," he sneered. "They cannot build airplanes." To him, the idea of women, Negroes, and immigrants assembling bombers was absurd, a farce, unworthy of serious thought. But Canaris was no longer laughing. He had seen the Soviet Union rise from ashes with American trucks and tinned meat. He had watched convoys cross the Atlantic, Liberty ships faster than the U-boats could sink them. And now, he held proof that the storm over Germany was not just coming, it was already forming. The air outside his office smelled faintly of coal smoke, but in his imagination, it was filled with another odor, aviation fuel, pouring from thousands of B-24 seconds that had yet to take wing. If Göring would not listen, there was only one man left to tell the Führer himself. Canaris folded the report carefully, as though shielding it from the arrogance that surrounded him. He knew he was carrying not just numbers, but a prophecy that could alter the course of the war. The question was, would Hitler hear it, or would he choose fantasy over fact? The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia was less a headquarters than a fortress of paranoia. Deep in the forest, concrete bunkers muffled every sound except the echo of boots on gravel. Here, reality bent to the will of one man. Reports that reached Adolf Hitler were carefully filtered, reshaped into the kind of stories he wanted to hear. The Wehrmacht still unstoppable, the Luftwaffe still supreme, the Reich still destined for victory. Into this theater of illusions, Admiral Canaris now carried a single sheet of paper that threatened to shatter the performance. He rehearsed the numbers silently as he walked past armed guards. 1 bomber an hour, 24 a day, more than 700 a month. His mind flickered back to a moment years before, when he was a junior officer reading Mahan's Influence of Sea Power. Then, as now, the lesson was clear. Wars are won not by courage alone, but by logistics, by the capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy. He knew Hitler despised such thinking. For the Führer, war was a mystical contest of will and blood. To argue otherwise was to risk being labeled defeatist, or worse, a traitor. When Canaris entered the briefing room, he found Hitler pacing, eyes blazing with that peculiar energy that terrified even his inner circle. Around him sat the generals and courtiers who had long since learned the art of survival. Agree, flatter, and never contradict. Canaris placed the report on the map table. He spoke calmly, outlining the intelligence, the sources, the consistency of the numbers. His words were met not with curiosity, but with contempt. Hitler's lip curled as he scanned the figures. Absurd. Amerikanische Lügengeneral, a Jewish trick. The room froze. No one dared support Canaris. Hermann Göring chuckled loudly, filling the silence, mocking the very idea that a nation of shopkeepers could build warplanes with conveyor belts. They will collapse from their own chaos, Göring declared, his rings glittering as he waved away the evidence. For Hitler, it was more than disbelief, it was insult. The thought that women, immigrants, and Negroes could accomplish what German engineers could not was an attack on his worldview. To accept it would be to accept that Nazism itself was a fraud. Canaris felt the blood drain from his face. He tried once more, pointing to the sheer capital investment, the specialized tools, the assembly line philosophy, perfected by Ford. He reminded them of America's automobile industry, which had once produced 5 million cars in a single year. But his words fell into the abyss. Hitler's eyes narrowed, not at the enemy, but at Canaris himself, as though the admiral's insistence were proof of hidden disloyalty. Afterward, in the cold corridors, Canaris allowed himself a rare moment of despair. He thought of his agents scattered across Europe, risking execution for every scrap of intelligence. He thought of the German cities that would soon lie under bomber streams birthed in Michigan. The truth had been delivered, but truth in the Third Reich was powerless against ideology. He buttoned his coat and walked out into the biting winter air, knowing that the skies over Germany would soon burn, and that its leaders had chosen blindness over survival. By late 1943, the prophecy of Willow Run began to take shape in the skies above Europe. What had been dismissed as propaganda now arrived with the rumble of engines that shook the earth. The U.S. 8th Air Force, newly reinforced, launched its daylight bombing raids with growing ferocity. Streams of B-24 Liberators, many rolled out of that mile-long plant in Michigan, crossed the North Sea and fanned out over the Reich. Their wings glinted in the pale sun, so numerous that German civilians on the ground swore the formations looked like migrating birds, blotting out the heavens. For the Luftwaffe, each mission became a battle of attrition it could not win. Brave German pilots climbed to meet the bombers, but for every fighter lost, replacements were scarce. Fuel shortages, already acute, worsened with every refinery hit. By contrast, for every Liberator shot down, 10 more crossed the Atlantic to replace it. The arithmetic was merciless, and it was exactly what Canaris had warned. The turning point came during Big Week in February 1944. Thousands of Allied bombers hammered the German aircraft industry itself, factories at Regensburg, Leipzig, Gotha, and Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense. Sky duels turned into slaughter. German pilots fell in flaming spirals, their parachutes blossoming uselessly as Allied escorts' new long-range P-51 Mustangs cut them down. In 1 week, the Luftwaffe lost a third of its operational strength. For the men flying, it was not abstract numbers but death in the cockpit, fuel gauges dropping to zero, engines sputtering as they tried to glide home over a burning homeland. In diaries, despair seeped through. One Luftwaffe general wrote bitterly, "The Reichsmarschall lives in fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." For the German people, the illusion cracked. Cities once promised invulnerability, now suffered night and day. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, names that became synonymous with firestorms. The smell of burning wood and flesh clung to the air long after the raids. Families huddled in cellars as masonry groaned above, their only light the trembling glow of candles. Meanwhile, at Willow Run, workers pushed harder, faster. The plant that had been mocked as "Will it run?" now proved unstoppable. Each bomber that rolled out carried not just bombs but the weight of a democratic society's defiance. Rosie the riveter, the African-American welder, the immigrant mechanic, all left fingerprints on the machines that now pounded the Reich. The irony was cruel. The very people Hitler dismissed as weak or inferior were dismantling his empire, one rivet, one flight, one raid at a time. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Without air cover, German armies reeled under Allied offensives in France, while on the Eastern Front, Soviet juggernauts rolled westward. The sky belonged to America, and with it, the future. Canaris's report had been correct, but his warning, ignored, now echoed only in the roar of thousands of engines overhead, the sound of industrial inevitability. For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of truth grew heavier with every raid that scorched German soil. His intelligence service, once respected for its precision, was now branded defeatist, its warnings painted as poison to morale. In Hitler's court, to acknowledge reality was to invite suspicion. Canaris, with his old-world manners and cool pragmatism, looked increasingly out of place among the fanatics. To some, he wasn't a loyal servant of the Reich at all, but a saboteur in uniform. In private, his disgust for the regime deepened. He had seen the massacres in the East, heard whispers of mass graves, and recoiled at the SS's brutality. He quietly used his Abwehr network to shield members of the resistance, men like the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He worked to keep Spain neutral, undermining Hitler's hopes of a new ally. To him, serving Germany no longer meant serving Hitler, it meant preventing total ruin. But secrets have a way of surfacing. After the failed July 20th, 1944 plot to kill Hitler, the Gestapo tore through the Abwehr. Files were seized, diaries uncovered, the net closed around Canaris. His warnings about Willow Run were now recast as evidence of defeatism, his private doubts as treason. In February 1945, he was dragged to Flossenburg concentration camp. There, in April, just weeks before Germany's surrender, Canaris was stripped naked and strangled with piano wire. A slow, deliberate killing ordered by a Führer raging against shadows. The man who had seen the truth most clearly died in silence, erased by the very blindness he had tried to dispel. Yet history preserved his vindication. By war's end, Willow Run had produced nearly 7,000 B-24 Liberators, plus thousands more kits assembled elsewhere. At its peak, a completed bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. The United States built over 300,000 military aircraft during the war. Germany managed less than a third of that. Numbers did not lie. America's factories, chaotic, diverse, democratic, had smothered the Reich beneath an avalanche of steel and aluminum. Albert Speer, Hitler's own armaments minister, would later admit in Allied custody that once he saw Willow Run's production figures, he knew Germany's defeat was inevitable. The Luftwaffe was not destroyed by poor pilots or inferior aircraft, but by arithmetic. For every Messerschmitt built, America built 10 Liberators. For every German pilot lost, America trained 10 more airmen. The Nazis had laughed at the notion that democracy could fight with discipline. In the end, it was democracy's ability to mobilize all its people, men and women, black and white, immigrant and native-born, that proved unstoppable. The tragedy was not that Germany lacked information. The Abwehr had delivered the truth. The tragedy was that its leaders chose not to believe it. They preferred myth over math, ideology over reality. In that fatal blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. Today, Willow Run stands as more than an industrial relic. It is a monument to what free societies can achieve when united, and a warning of what happens when leaders ignore truth. On that March morning in 1943, Canaris held a piece of paper that could have altered history. Instead, it was dismissed, laughed at, buried. And so, the Reich was buried with it. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the reckoning with numbers was staggering. Willow Run alone had produced nearly 7,000 B-24 Liberators, more heavy bombers from one American plant than the entire German aircraft industry had managed in the whole war. Across all U.S. factories, the total soared past 18,000 Liberators and over 300,000 aircraft of every type. Germany's total, roughly 94,000. The math that Canaris had carried on a single sheet of paper was not only accurate, it had been conservative. For the men and women who worked at Willow Run, the statistics were written in sweat and grease. Shifts that stretched through the night, hands blistered from rivet guns, lungs filled with the metallic scent of aluminum dust. Yet there was pride too. In lunchrooms and locker halls, workers taped newspaper clippings of bombers striking at Berlin and Cologne, whispering, "That's our plane up there." In a democracy, the war effort was not commanded from a single voice, but powered by millions of ordinary ones. For Germans under the bombs, the reality was smoke, rubble, and the endless wail of sirens. A boy in Hamburg recalled running barefoot across glass-strewn streets, the air still glowing red from the firestorm. A mother in Leipzig wrote in her diary of children coughing black soot, their skin gray with ash. They had been told the Reich would never fall. Yet above them droned the proof of the lie. Row upon row of American bombers, born from an assembly line they had been assured could never exist. History, in the end, judged harshly. The Abwehr spies had risked their lives to gather the truth. They had succeeded. What failed was the leadership that refused to see. Hitler, Goering, and their circle of fanatics, were not defeated by secret weapons or brilliant maneuvers. They were undone by arithmetic, by their inability to believe that free men and women, working together, could outbuild their empire. Willow Run's legacy endures as a symbol of both human ingenuity and the perils of arrogance. It was not sleek rocket science or mythical wonder weapons that sealed the Reich's fate, but the steady rhythm of rivet guns, the roar of furnaces, and the hum of conveyor belts. It was the embodiment of Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy, proving that in total war, factories could be as decisive as armies. And so, the story circles back to that wood-paneled office in Berlin, where Canaris first read the numbers. In that moment, the war's ending had already been written. It was not written in battles or speeches, but in production schedules, shipping manifests, and the unrelenting march of industry. The tragedy was not ignorance, it was willful blindness. The Reich chose myth over math, and it was buried beneath an avalanche of steel. Willow Run, noisy and imperfect, became the machine that broke the machine of war. And its echo reminds us still, the deadliest weapon of the Second World War was not a gun, or a tank, or even an atomic bomb. It was the assembly line.